Well, as companies return to work and public venues resume operations, many organisations are implementing temperature measurement as a condition of entry. A number of security companies have also started selling fever detecting systems, relying on infrared and thermal detection cameras to measure temperature. But do they work? Joining me now live is security expert from Calamity, Daniel Lukovitz. Daniel, great to see you again. Thank you for joining me.
Nika.
Firstly, can you take us through how these infrared camera systems actually work?
Well, in many cases they actually don't, but the theory is something like this. The camera uses infrared thermal detection to measure the temperature of everybody who's passing through the field of view of cameras. So anybody who's travelled through an Asian airport in the last decade would have seen them set up at checkpoints there where they basically measure people, and anybody who's got an elevated temperature can be pulled aside and subject to further more invasive temperature checking and medical screening and so forth as a way of preventing infection.
And we've just got some vision of that on our screen right now, of it in action. There have been some previous warnings that perhaps these thermal cameras might not even be fit for purpose in respect to COVID-19.
So the vision that you're looking at the moment is actually a promotional video from one of the vendors. And what you'll notice is that many of the people in it are actually wearing glasses. Now, the vendor's own documentation will always say that you can't be wearing glasses to get an accurate read, which essentially means that anybody who's wearing a hat, who's wearing glasses, or the camera's been improperly installed is going to result in negative detection, which essentially means that these things can provide a false sense of security and not detect people who may actually be infected. Now, that's assuming that the camera systems actually work in the first place. But the bigger problem is that we know that sometimes as many as 80% of people infected with, say, COVID-19 are asymptomatic. That is, they show no visible symptoms, they don't feel unwell, they don't have an elevated temperature. So in many cases, you could be screening someone with a system like this, and even if it works, which is questionable, it's going to say, yes, this person is absolutely fine, and that's going to create a false sense of security, as opposed to an alternative situation where people in a workplace or a public venue can assume that they're infected and everyone else around them is infected and can take precautions accordingly.
Are there any security concerns over this?
Well, there are significant ones. I mean, a lot of companies are basically trying to do the right thing. They're trying to get back to work. They're trying to open their doors, and they're trying to keep their own staff and their customers safe. But the problem with all of these things is this technology has essentially come out of nowhere. And although, thermal scanning's been around for a long time, this has become a multi-billion-dollar industry virtually overnight. There's a fantastic American organisation called IPVM who's done some really great work in actually assessing the vendor claims, what does work, what doesn't. So one of the things they found, for example, is that something as simple as having a bit of hair crossing over someone's forehead can make a big difference on whether or not this technology actually works. So unless you also have a security person or someone at a reception or a concierge who's actually making sure people, have their hair out of the way, it's not going to be good. The other thing that you'll also see a lot of is, well-intentioned but perhaps poorly considered temperature checking scenarios. For example, checking people's temperature outside of a school or outside of a shop. So, right now in Australia, it's winter. And if someone's checking your temperature on a street that's 8 degrees in the morning, your skin temperature is actually going to be lower. So even a person with a scorching fever could present to one of those checking stations and come up clean. So it really is creating a false sense of security. But the problem is that businesses see this technology and they go, that's a really good idea. We should put that in our place of business. And so these things sort of, if you'll pardon the pun, they spread virally, a bit like those little sticky footprints that you're seeing in all sorts of shops at the moment as well. People think it's a good idea, but in many cases, it creates a false sense of security that's worse than no security at all. At least when you know you're going into an environment, be it a shopping centre or a retailer, and you assume that there's infection risk everywhere, you can take appropriate precautions, whether that's face covering, social distancing, hand sanitising, or just simply not going. Whereas once you put these systems in, it's very easy for people to assume, oh, I must be okay because they're checking everybody. And in many cases, these systems have the fundamental inability to detect COVID-19 because many of the carriers are going to be asymptomatic.
Yes, and I must say, even I was at a government building recently after the pouring weather, bad rain, and they asked me, why are you so cold? What's wrong with you? But I guess, would you say that this is almost a mistake that many organisations are making in returning to work?
Well, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, the TGA, actually has a register of therapeutic goods, and they've made it unequivocally clear that this technology using cameras to detect fever does classify it as a medical device. And so what that means is it needs to be approved, it needs to be on the register of therapeutic goods. And most of these cameras are not. There's been a huge influx of this technology coming in from China and from Chinese state-owned corporations, and it's not on the TGA's list. And so it's actually a criminal offence for them to be putting these in. And the problem is companies don't know this. You know, they buy it from a security installer, or they see something online and perhaps they import it themselves. I mean, we're a security business, we install cameras, and we've had a lot of people in the last few weeks say, I bought something just off the internet and I'd like you to install it. And I've had to say to them, this is actually a medical problem and it's a very significant issue. You know, are you sure you've actually thought this out? Workplaces create other problems as well, which is, all right, let's say you had a system that worked 100% reliably and it could detect when a person was ill. Well, what's your policy then? Are you going to send them home? Are they going to take the day off work? And so then you get the alternative situation, which is people who need to come to work because they need to work or they need to get paid, or perhaps they want to go into a once-in-a-lifetime concert and not be prevented from that by thermal screening. They might actually try and sort of trick the system, which is very easy to do by, you know, wearing a hat or glasses, or perhaps, you know, splashing some ice water on your forehead before you go in. So these are, you know, really sort of feel-good measures, but they don't actually have any sort of underpinning risk assessment that goes against them. And that's something that concerns me as a security risk professional who knows what happens when things go wrong. I mean, Danica, imagine a situation where there was a metal detector at an airport, but whoever supplied that metal detector knew that it had somewhere between a 20 and a 60% failure rate of detecting firearms going onto the plane. People would lose their mind. But that's exactly what's happening with this technology. And so there's all sorts of cute videos like the one you're seeing at the moment where it shows people merrily walking through a corridor with hats and they're all bunched up and so forth. If you actually read the fine print, their own fine print specifically says don't use them this way. But of course, it's not their problem once they sell this and once it goes in. And I suppose, unlike letting a firearm through a metal detector, when these things fail, it's very quiet. You don't realise that you actually just let a super spreader through that's going to infect everybody. So, you know, there's a lot of problems with this. And the interesting thing is one of those companies, Dahua, it's the second largest surveillance CCTV manufacturer in the world. It's a Chinese state-owned corporation. They were specifically told by the TGA that, you know, their products are not approved here, and they've been selling it anyway. And to me, there's almost some irony of a Chinese state-owned company selling this technology as a supposed preventative measure against COVID-19. Yeah. I guess it's analogous to if someone just ran over your family and then tried to sell you the first aid kit afterward. I think people need to be a lot more careful about what they put in and not get attracted to shiny new things, because we all want to get through this. We all want to get past this, but there's no easy answers. This is a very complicated problem, and just throwing something up on the wall is not a reliable way of preventing it.
Absolutely. It's certainly a very interesting space, and I guess we'll hear more about it as we all try and navigate this COVID world. Daniel Lukowitz, great to chat to you. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Danica.